Jason Cole had everything a man could desire: wealth, status, and power. Born into privilege, he was the only son of Arthur Cole, a ruthless businessman who believed emotions were a weakness. From an early age, Jason was taught that money could solve any problem, that power meant bending people to his will, and that kindness was for the weak. He grew up with the belief that respect was demanded, not earned, and as a result, he became the type of man who took pleasure in making others feel small. By the time he turned 25, Jason had mastered the art of cruelty. He surrounded himself with a group of equally heartless friends, men who thrived on excess and destruction. Together, they ruled the city's nightlife, burning through money like it was nothing. They gambled recklessly, drank endlessly, and humiliated anyone they deemed beneath them. But Jason was the worst of them all. He took special joy in breaking people, in reminding them that their struggles meant nothing in the face of his wealth. One evening, after a particularly wild party, Jason found himself wandering the dimly lit streets of downtown, his pockets lined with cash from a poker game he had effortlessly won. His friends, equally intoxicated, laughed loudly as they stumbled out of a luxury car and into the cold night air. That was when they spotted him, the old man sitting on the curb, wrapped in tattered clothes, his hands cupped as he quietly begged for spare change. Jason smirked. He despised beggars. In his mind, they were the lowest form of life, parasites feeding off society's pity. He walked up to the man and dangled a crisp $100 bill in front of him, letting it flutter just beyond his reach. "You want this, old man?" Jason asked, his voice dripping with mockery. The homeless man looked up, his eyes dark and sunken, filled with something unreadable. "Only if it comes from kindness," he murmured. Jason scoffed. "Kindness? I don't do charity." With that, he let the bill fall to the ground, only to step on it with his polished leather shoe. His friends roared with laughter as the old man silently watched, unflinching. "Your wealth won't save you from the price of your soul," the old man said softly, his voice carrying an eerie certainty. Jason froze for a moment, then rolled his eyes. "What, you gonna curse me, old man?" He laughed loudly. "Yeah, sure, I'll be sure to look out for that." With a final sneer, he kicked the money toward the gutter and walked away, the old man's eyes still burning into his back. Later that night, Jason and his crew found themselves at an underground casino, the air thick with the scent of whiskey and desperation. The stakes were high, but Jason thrived on the rush. Cards in hand, he leaned back confidently, knowing that no matter what, he could always buy his way out of trouble. It was close to midnight when one of his friends dared him to do something even more outrageous. "Come on, Cole," the guy slurred. "Let's do something that'll make this night legendary." Jason smirked. "Like what?" "The mortuary. Let's go inside." The challenge was absurd, disrespectful, and exactly the kind of thing Jason lived for. Without hesitation, they made their way to the city's oldest funeral home, sneaking through the back entrance under the cover of darkness. The air inside was cold, stale with the scent of antiseptic and something far less pleasant. Metal tables lined the room, covered bodies resting beneath white sheets. Jason, unbothered, walked over to one of the covered corpses. "Let's see who's hiding under here," he whispered mischievously, pulling back the sheet. It was a woman, her face pale, lifeless, and yet strangely peaceful. His friends gasped, but Jason only chuckled. "Look at her, lying there like she owns the place," he mocked, poking her cold hand. Suddenly, a voice from the shadows broke the silence. "You have mocked the dead tonight," the mortuary attendant said, stepping forward, his eyes sharp and full of warning. "But mark my words, young man, the dead do not forget." Jason laughed, unfazed. But as he walked out of the mortuary, a cold shiver crawled down his spine. He shook it off, unaware that from that moment on, his life would never be the same. The night air was thick and humid as Jason and his friends stumbled out of the mortuary, their laughter echoing down the empty street. The thrill of sneaking past the city's oldest funeral home sent an adrenaline rush through their veins. But Jason felt something else, something he couldn't quite place. It was subtle at first, a lingering chill in the warm summer night, a faint whisper in the back of his mind. He shook it off, convinced it was nothing more than a mix of exhaustion and alcohol. By the time he got home, the feeling had worsened. His penthouse, usually a sanctuary of excess and luxury, felt suffocatingly quiet. The sleek modern furniture, the dim glow of the city skyline through floor to ceiling windows. It all seemed somehow unfamiliar. He loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. But as he lifted the glass to his lips, he caught something in the reflection of the window. A shadow. A figure standing just behind him. Jason spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Get a grip, Cole," he muttered, rubbing his temples. He had seen nothing. The mortuary stunt was just messing with his head. But then, the whisper came. It was faint, almost carried by wind, yet unmistakable. "Jason." He froze, his entire body locking up. The voice was soft, eerie, barely above a breath. His grip tightened around the whiskey glass, and for the first time in years, a tendril of fear curled around his spine. He turned the TV on, cranking the volume up, trying to drown out the silence. He refused to be rattled. He had mocked an old man, stolen from the weak, laughed at death itself. There was no consequence for a man like him. His world was built on power, and fear had no place in it. But as he lay in bed that night, the whisper came again. "Jason. Jason." This time, it was right by his ear. He jolted upright, heart hammering against his ribs. His room was empty, the city lights outside casting long shadows across the sleek furniture. A dream. It had to be a dream. He tried to go back to sleep, but the moment his eyes shut, the bed beneath him turned ice cold. A chill seeped through the sheets, cutting through his skin like frozen blades. He gasped, sitting up again, but something was wrong. His breath came out in visible puffs. His penthouse was never this cold. Then the bed creaked. Not from his movement, from something else. Something unseen. His blood ran cold. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The weight on the mattress shifted, as though something, was climbing in beside him. Jason scrambled for the light switch, fumbling in blind panic. The moment the lamp flicked on, the cold vanished, the room returning to its normal temperature. He exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, though his voice trembled. He needed sleep. He needed a distraction. Anything to shake this feeling. The next morning, the sun streamed through his windows, bathing the room in golden light. The terror of the night before felt distant, like a bad dream. By the time he stepped into his sports car and revved the engine, his confidence had returned. He was Jason Cole. He didn't fear the dark. But as he pulled onto the highway, his rearview mirror flickered. For a split second, he saw it. The woman from the mortuary. Pale, lifeless, sitting in his back seat. Jason slammed on the brakes, swerving onto the side of the road, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He twisted around, but the seat was empty. A hallucination, a trick of the light. He wiped a hand over his face, forcing a chuckle. "Too much whiskey," he muttered. But deep down, something gnawed at him. Something he refused to acknowledge. The dead do not forget. Jason woke up to the sound of his phone vibrating aggressively against the nightstand. His head pounded from the whiskey he had downed the night before, and for a brief moment he struggled to remember why he had woken up drenched in sweat, his heart racing like he had just outrun something. Then it all came flooding back. The whispers, the cold presence in his bed, the figure in his rearview mirror. He groaned, rubbing his face as he grabbed his phone. The screen flashed with an unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something in his gut told him to pick up. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Yeah." His voice came out hoarse. Silence. "Who the hell is this?" he snapped. Then, a whisper. "Jason." His breath hitched, his grip tightening around the phone. It was the same voice. Soft. Haunting. It sent a slow, icy wave down his spine. His instincts screamed at him to hang up, to throw the phone across the room. But then came another sound. Faint, distorted breathing, like someone struggling to inhale through ruined lungs. His blood ran cold. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice unsteady. The line went dead. Jason shot up from bed, his pulse slamming against his ribs. His penthouse, bathed in the early morning light, felt suffocating. He needed air. He needed air. He needed out. Throwing on a hoodie and grabbing his car keys, he stormed out of his place, shoving past his doorman without a second glance. The streets were already alive with the morning rush, people moving in their own chaotic rhythms, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. He needed to shake this. It was all in his head. A bad dream. The stress of work. Maybe even guilt, though he had never allowed himself to feel such a useless emotion before. But then, as he approached his car, his stomach twisted. Scratched into the glossy black paint of his door were 4 deep, jagged words. "The dead do not forget." His breath stalled in his throat. His mind raced. Had one of his friends done this as a sick joke? Maybe someone had seen him at the mortuary and decided to scare him. But how would they know about the whispers? The phone call? Jason clenched his jaw, forcing himself to laugh under his breath. "All right, fine. You got me," he muttered, glancing around, as if expecting someone to jump out and reveal it was all a prank. No one did. With a sharp exhale, he slid into the driver's seat and peeled onto the road, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He told himself he was fine, that this was nothing. But as he sped through the city, every shadow felt heavier. Every glance in his rearview mirror felt like a risk. He couldn't shake the crawling sensation on the back of his neck, like unseen fingers brushing against his skin. He refused to acknowledge it. Jason drove until he found himself at a familiar spot, a sleek, glass-walled skyscraper that housed his father's empire. He didn't know why he had come here. Maybe because it was the one place where logic and power ruled. A place where money fixed everything. He stormed through the pristine lobby, ignoring the greetings from the staff as he made his way to Arthur Cole's office. The moment he stepped inside, his father barely glanced up from his desk. "Jason." The older man's voice was cold, unreadable. "To what do I owe this surprise visit?" Jason swallowed, forcing his expression into something detached. "I need to ask you something." Arthur finally looked up, his piercing gaze unwavering. Jason hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Have you ever pissed someone off so badly that they'd want to mess with you in a way that feels..." He hesitated, searching for the right word. Unnatural?" His father's expression remained impassive. "I piss people off every day. It's the cost of power." Jason exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "Yeah, but..." He cut himself off. He couldn't say it. He couldn't tell his father about the whispers, the phone call, the writing on his car. His father didn't believe in anything that couldn't be bought or crushed. Arthur set his pen down, studying him. "Are you in some kind of trouble, Jason?" Jason forced a smirk. "When am I not?" His father didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "If you have enemies, deal with them. If you've made mistakes, fix them. You know how this works." Jason clenched his jaw. His father had always seen life in such simple terms. Money, power, control. But Jason wasn't sure any of those things could fix what was happening to him. Arthur's phone buzzed, and just like that, Jason was dismissed. "If you're not here for business, don't waste my time." Jason didn't argue. He turned and walked out, but as he reached the elevator, he caught his reflection in the glass doors. And for a split second, stand just behind him, was her. The dead woman from the mortuary. Her hollow eyes met his in the reflection. Then the lights flickered, and she was gone. Jason staggered back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. A cold sweat slicked his skin. This wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't just guilt. Something was coming for him, and there was no running from it. Jason barely remembered driving back to his penthouse. His mind was trapped in a loop, replaying what he had seen in the reflection of the elevator doors. The woman. The same pale, lifeless face from the mortuary. But it wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. His brain was playing tricks on him. It had to be. Yet, the weight of unseen eyes pressing on him, the eerie whispers that now seemed to lurk in every quiet moment, it was getting harder to ignore. By the time he reached his building, he felt like he was suffocating. The valet greeted him with a nod, but Jason barely acknowledged him as he stormed into the lobby. He needed to shake this off, needed to get his head straight. As he stepped into the private elevator, the walls of the mirrored space felt tighter than usual. The air inside was thick, pressing down on him. He kept his eyes trained on the closed doors, refusing to look at the reflection. Then the lights flickered. A sharp breath hitched in his throat. The overhead bulbs stuttered again, plunging the space into half-darkness for a fraction of a second before the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the elevator in an eerie red glow. And then he saw it. Not in the mirror this time. In the corner of the elevator behind him, a figure, thin, motionless, her dark hair hanging over her face. Jason's breath came in short, panicked bursts. His body went rigid as ice slid down his spine. He wanted to turn, to confirm that it wasn't real, but fear held him in place. Then, ever so slowly, the figure moved. Not a step, not a shift, just a tilt of the head. A low, rasping whisper filled the space. "Jason. Jason." His stomach twisted violently. The doors dinged open. He launched himself out of the elevator, nearly tripping over his own feet as he stumbled into the hallway of his penthouse floor. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with his keys, his breath ragged, pulse hammering against his ribs. When he finally pushed the door open and stepped inside, he slammed it shut behind him, locking it without hesitation. He leaned against the cool wood, his chest rising and falling in heavy pants. Silence. But it didn't feel like he was alone. Jason forced himself to move, turning on every light in his penthouse as he stalked from room to room. The place was empty, exactly as he had left it. Still, the feeling didn't leave. Grabbing the nearest bottle of whiskey, he poured himself a glass with unsteady hands and downed it in one gulp. The burn in his throat was grounding, but it did nothing to slow the racing in his mind. Then came the sound. A faint scratching. Jason froze, his ears straining to locate the source. The noise grew louder, a slow, deliberate scrape against glass. His gaze snapped toward the massive floor, to ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. And there, pressed against the outside of the glass was a handprint. Jason's stomach dropped. He was 40 stories up. There was no ledge, no balcony, no way for anyone to be standing outside. Yet the print remained. Then, right before his eyes, the condensation on the glass shifted. Letters began to form. The dead do not forget. Jason staggered back, the glass of whiskey slipping from his grip and shattering on the marble floor. His entire body was trembling now. This was real. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't paranoia. Something was haunting him. Something wanted him to pay. And for the first time in his life, Jason Cole didn't know how to buy his way out. Jason didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. The whisper of his name slithered through the air, crawling over his skin like ice. He sat on the edge of his bed, gripping the whiskey bottle like a lifeline, staring at the window where the handprint had been. When the sun finally bled through the skyline, casting its golden glow over the city, Jason felt no relief. The daylight didn't chase away the unease. It only made the fear settle deeper into his bones. He couldn't do this alone. For the first time in his life, Jason Cole admitted to himself that he needed help. The problem was, there weren't many people he could trust. His so-called friends would laugh in his face. His father, not a chance. That left only one person, a woman he had wronged, a woman he had humiliated. Miriam. He didn't know why he thought of her now, but something in his gut told him she was the only one who might listen. By the time he reached the rundown street where she sold fruit from a small wooden stand, Jason's hands were slick with sweat. He felt ridiculous being here. What was he expecting? That she'd just forgive him, that she'd believe him. She saw him before he could speak, her sharp, weathered eyes locked onto him. Her expression unreadable. "Well," she said, setting down an orange. "If it isn't the great Jason Cole. Come to take more from the poor." Jason swallowed hard. "I need your help." Miriam scoffed, shaking her head. "Now, isn't that something? The man who laughed at my struggle, who kicked my baskets and walked away as I begged for mercy. Now he needs me." He clenched his fists. She studied him, her gaze slow and deliberate. Then she turned her attention back to peeling an orange. "Go to a doctor, Cole. Go to a doctor, Cole. Go to a therapist. Rich men like you always think money can fix what's broken." "This isn't something money can fix," Jason said, his voice tight. He hesitated, then admitted the truth. I think I'm cursed." Miriam's hands stilled. She looked at him again, but this time her gaze was different. "Cursed," she echoed. "What did you do?" Jason hesitated. And then, for the first time, he told the truth. He told her about the mortuary, about the body he had mocked, about the whispers that followed. He told her about the handprint on the glass, the scratches in the night, the reflection of a woman who shouldn't exist. As the words spilled from his lips, Miriam's face grew dark, her eyes flickering with something close to fear. When he finished, silence stretched between them. Then Miriam exhaled slowly. "You fool." Jason stiffened. "What?" "You don't mock the dead, Cole." Her voice was quiet but firm, like a mother scolding a reckless child. "The spirits, especially those who have died in sorrow and pain, do not rest easy. And when you disrespect them, when you taunt them..." Her eyes met his, unwavering. They remember. Jason swallowed, his throat dry. So what do I do? Miriam considered him for a long moment, then nodded toward an old wooden chair beside her stand. Sit. Jason, for once in his life, obeyed. She reached beneath her stall and pulled out a small leather pouch. When she opened it, Jason caught the scent of something earthy, old, herbs, maybe. She took out a handful of dried leaves and sprinkled them into a bowl, then lit them with a match. Smoke curled into the air, and Jason felt his skin prickle. This is a cleansing ritual, Miriam murmured. It will help, but it won't erase what you've done. Jason watched as she waved the smoke around him, chanting softly under her breath. The language was one he didn't recognize, but something about it made his skin crawl. Then, just as he started to relax, the fire in the bowl exploded. A burst of heat, a crackling spark. The bowl shattered, sending ashes flying. Jason jumped to his feet as Miriam gasped, her eyes wide with shock. The air grew heavy, cold. And then the whisper. Jason, Jason. Jason turned, but no one was there. Miriam's face drained of color. She grabbed his wrist, her fingers ice cold. She is not done with you. Jason's pulse pounded. What do you mean? Miriam's grip tightened. This isn't just a curse. You didn't just anger a spirit, Jason. She swallowed, her voice dropping to a whisper. She has chosen you. Jason's stomach twisted at Miriam's words. She has chosen you. The sentence echoed in his mind, wrapping around him like a noose. He yanked his hand free, stepping back. What the hell does that mean? His voice was rough, a mixture of panic and disbelief. Miriam's expression remained grave. She dusted the ashes off her hands and slowly sat back down, folding her arms. There are spirits that linger, Jason. Some because they seek revenge, others because they seek revenge, because they are searching for something they lost. Jason swallowed hard. And which one is this? Miriam exhaled through her nose. That depends. Tell me again.
What exactly did you do to her?
Jason clenched his jaw. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to relive it, but the weight of her stare demanded an answer. I pulled back the sheet. I laughed at her. I mocked her. Miriam's lips parted slightly. A flash of something, horror maybe, crossed her face. Jason noticed. What? He demanded. What does that mean? Miriam looked down, as if debating whether or not to tell him the truth. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, more cautious. Some spirits, she began, remain trapped between the world of the living and the dead because they died alone. Forgotten. Unloved. If a spirit like that is touched, her eyes locked onto his, sharp as a blade, it can take that as a claim. Jason's chest tightened. You're saying she believes you belong to her now. A cold chill swept through Jason's veins. That's insane. Miriam didn't blink. Is it? Jason let out a shaky breath, raking a hand through his hair. What do I do? How do I do? Miriam's fingers traced the rim of a small wooden bowl on her stand. Spirits like this don't just let go, Jason. They don't forgive easily. You have to make amends. You have to make amends. You have to help her find peace. Jason scoffed. And how exactly do I do that? Miriam looked up at him, her face unreadable. You find out who she was. You give her the respect she was denied in life. And then, she hesitated. You give her a proper burial, one with honor. Jason shook his head. You're kidding. She didn't respond. He turned away, laughing bitterly. This is ridiculous. I don't have time to play detective for a ghost. Then, she will never leave you. The finality in Miriam's voice made his breath catch. He turned back to her, and for the first time, he saw something new in her expression. This wasn't just superstition to her. She believed this. And, worst of all, deep down, so did he. Jason clenched his fists. Where do I start? Miriam studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded toward the road. There's an old priest. His name is Father Gideon. He knows about the dead more than anyone in this city. If anyone can tell you who she was, it's him. Jason exhaled slowly. He hated every second of this, but he knew he didn't have a choice. Because if what Miriam said was true, then his nightmare was just beginning. And this thing, this woman, was never going to let him go. Jason drove through the winding streets, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The city lights blurred past him, but his mind wasn't on the road. It was on Miriam's warning. She believes you belong to her now. The thought sent another chill down his spine. He had never believed in ghosts, curses, or anything beyond what money could buy. But this wasn't something he could rationalize away. Not anymore. The address Miriam had given him led to an old church on the outskirts of the city. It stood isolated from the modern skyline, its towering steeple casting long shadows under the flickering streetlights. Jason pulled into the empty parking lot and killed the engine. The air was thick with the scent of rain and damp earth as he climbed the stone steps, his footsteps echoing against the heavy wooden doors. He hesitated for a moment before knocking. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. A rustling sound came from inside, and then the door creaked open. Standing before him was Father Gideon. The man was old, his face carved with deep lines that spoke of years spent listening to confessions no one else wanted to hear. His gray eyes, sharp despite his age, studied Jason in silence. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice low, almost cautious. Jason swallowed. Miriam sent me. Father Gideon's expression darkened at the mention of her name. He stepped aside, motioning for Jason to enter. The church was dimly lit, the scent of old wood and candle wax filling the air. Stained glass windows cast colorful patches of light on the stone floor. Jason followed the priest down a long hallway lined with wooden pews. They reached a small room at the back, cluttered with books and faded photographs. Father Gideon gestured for Jason to sit while he moved to a shelf. Father Gideon gestured for Jason to sit while he moved to a shelf, running his fingers along the worn spines of old records. She told me you're looking for someone, the priest said, his back still turned. Jason hesitated. Not someone. Something. Father Gideon's fingers stilled over a book. He turned to face Jason, his gaze unreadable. Tell me. Jason exhaled slowly. He told him everything. The mortuary, the whispers, the handprint on his window. The reflection of the dead woman watching him. When he finished, the room was silent. Father Gideon finally pulled out an old leather-bound book and set it on the table between them. Dust rose as he flipped through the fragile pages, his expression grim. What you've done, he said slowly, is far worse than you realize. Jason clenched his jaw.
Yeah, I got that part. What the hell does she want from me?
The priest stopped on a page. His fingers traced the faded ink as he spoke. Her name was Anna Delcroix. Jason's stomach twisted. It was the first time he had heard the name. And somehow, it made everything feel more real. She died 20 years ago, Gideon continued. Alone, unclaimed. Her body was never given a proper burial. No family, no friends. She was forgotten. Jason ran a hand over his face. And because He hesitated, the word mocked, feeling like an understatement. Because I disturbed her. She's, what? Haunting me? Father Gideon closed the book with a soft thud. It's more than that. Spirits like hers. They don't just haunt. They claim. Jason felt his throat tighten. Claim. Father Gideon leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto Jason's. She doesn't want revenge. A cold dread settled over Jason's chest. She wants you. Silence thickened the air. Jason's pulse pounded. No, he said, shaking his head. That's not happening. Father Gideon's gaze didn't waver. You don't have a choice. Jason shot up from his chair, pacing the small room. His mind raced. He could barely process what he was hearing. This is insane, he muttered. I just need to... The lights flickered. Jason stopped. Father Gideon tensed. A sudden chill crept into the room, and Jason felt the familiar weight of something unseen pressing down on him. The whisper came, soft but unmistakable. Jason, Jason. His breath hitched. Father Gideon grabbed his wrist, forcing Jason to look at him. There's only one way to stop this, he said, his voice urgent. You must lay her to rest. Give her the burial she never had. Jason swallowed hard. And if I don't? Father Gideon's grip tightened. Then she will take you with her. Jason's stomach twisted at Father Gideon's words. Take me with her. The weight of those 4 words pressed into his chest like a vice. His pulse pounded as he yanked his wrist free from the priest's grip. That's not happening, he snapped. I don't belong to her. I don't belong to anyone. Father Gideon's expression remained grim. You already do. Jason's jaw tightened. He refused to believe this. There had to be another way. He had spent his entire life bending the world to his will, buying his way out of trouble, controlling his own fate. He wasn't going to be claimed by some ghost. Let's say I do this, Jason said, forcing his voice to stay steady. Let's say I give her a burial. That's it? She just lets me go? Father Gideon hesitated. That pause made Jason's stomach sink. It's not that simple, the priest admitted. A burial alone may not be enough. You mocked her. You humiliated her. You desecrated her body. Jason flinched at the truth of it. Gideon continued, his voice low. Some spirits, when they are wronged, do not just seek peace. They seek balance. Jason's fingers curled into fists. What does that mean? The priest sighed, standing and moving toward a tall wooden cabinet. He unlocked it, revealing shelves lined with aged tomes, old artifacts, and a small box wrapped in worn cloth. He took the box, unwrapping it carefully before setting it on the table. Inside was a thin, rusted, silver band. Simple, unadorned, but radiating something Jason couldn't explain. She has bound herself to you, Gideon said, nodding toward the ring. The only way to sever that connection is to give her what she desires most. Jason swallowed. He didn't want to ask. But he had to. And what does she desire most? Gideon met his gaze, the answer heavy on his tongue. Marriage. Jason let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You're joking. I wish I were. Jason ran a hand down his face, shaking his head.
No?
No way. That's insane. You don't have to love her, Gideon said carefully. You don't even have to mean it. But the ritual must be performed. A symbolic union. A vow given. Jason stared at him, disbelief slamming through his skull. So let me get this straight, he said, his voice edged with anger. I have to marry a dead woman in order to get rid of her. Gideon nodded. Jason clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. And if I don't? The lights flickered. The air dropped 10 degrees. A shadow stretched along the floor, curling toward Jason's feet like reaching fingers. The whisper came again. Jason. A cold breath touched the back of his neck. Jason felt her. She was here. His breath turned shallow. The walls of the church seemed to close in around him, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. He turned his head slowly, afraid of what he would see. But there was nothing. Only the cold. Only the growing pressure in his chest. Gideon exhaled sharply, reaching into his robe. He pulled out a small vial of liquid and flung it toward the shadow creeping across the floor. The moment the droplets hit, the temperature snapped back to normal. The light steadied. The presence recoiled, not gone, but held at bay. Jason gasped for breath. His legs felt unsteady. Gideon sat back down, wiping sweat from his brow. You don't have much time, Jason. Jason didn't respond. He just stared at the faint remnants of the shadow that had almost reached him. He was running out of options. And worse, he was running out of time. Jason barely made it out of the church before the nausea hit. His body was drenched in cold sweat, his legs trembling as if they barely belonged to him. The weight of Father Gideon's words crushed down on him. You don't have much time. His mind raced, spiraling between disbelief and raw panic. He couldn't do this. He wouldn't do this. Marrying a ghost, a spirit, that wasn't just insane. It was impossible. And yet, Jason still felt her presence. It clung to him like a second skin, an invisible force pressing against his chest, curling around his lungs like smoke. Every breath felt heavier. Every shadow stretched longer. He got into his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His reflection in the rearview mirror was pale, drawn. He looked like a man being hunted. Because he was. With a sharp exhale, he pulled onto the road, his tires screeching against the pavement as he sped through the city. He had no plan, no destination. He just needed to move. But the further he drove, the more the city felt off. The streets were too empty. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie pools of light that seemed to twist and distort. Even the air felt wrong. Too thick, too still. Jason's hands tightened around the wheel. Then, in the distance, a woman stood at the intersection. Not moving, not waving. Just watching. His stomach twisted violently. Manna. Her dark hair hung limply over her shoulders, her white dress whispering against the pavement despite the lack of wind. Her face, pale and hollow, was turned directly toward him. Jason slammed his foot on the gas. He didn't care if she wasn't real. Didn't care if this was a hallucination, a trick of his own failing sanity. He just needed to get away. The car roared forward, but as he approached the intersection, Anna didn't move. She didn't flinch. And then, the lights went out. Not just the streetlights. All of them. The buildings, the signs, the city, the world plunged into darkness. Jason's breath hitched. His grip on wheels slipped. The engine died. The radio cut out. And suddenly, he was no longer in his car. He was standing, barefoot. The pavement beneath him was ice cold, wet with something thick and sticky. Jason turned sharply, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He wasn't in the city anymore. He was in a cemetery. A vast, endless field of graves stretched before him, headstones jutting from the earth like broken teeth. Fog curled around his ankles, shifting unnaturally as though alive. He stumbled back, his pulse hammering. And then he saw her. Not at a distance this time. She was right in front of him. Anna. Ganna. Her sunken eyes locked onto his, filled with something far worse than anger. Possession. Jason tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. His breath came in ragged gasps as Anna lifted her hand. Slowly, gently, like a lover reaching for his cheek. You belong to me now, Jason. Her fingers brushed his skin, and agony exploded in his chest. White-hot pain ripped through him, like icy claws burrowing under his ribs, twisting deep inside his core. He choked, his knees buckling, his vision blurring. Then, the world snapped back into place. Jason jerked awake, gasping, his body convulsing. He was back in his car, parked at the side of the road, the engine still off, the city still dark. But his chest still burned. Trembling, he pulled down the collar of his shirt. His breath hitched. There, just above his heart, a handprint. Dark, shadowy, burned into his skin. Jason's stomach twisted. This wasn't just haunting anymore. This was a claim. And he was running out of time. Jason's hands shook as he touched the dark, burned handprint over his chest. His breath was uneven, his pulse erratic. The mark throbbed, radiating a coldness that seeped into his bones. This wasn't just an illusion. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. A sharp knock on the driver's side window nearly made him jump out of his skin. Jason twisted around, his heart slamming against his ribs. A police officer stood outside, his flashlight pointed at Jason's face. The beam was too bright, too intrusive, and for a split second, Jason expected to see her standing beside him instead. But she wasn't there. "Sir, are you all right?" the officer asked, his voice steady but wary. "You've been sitting here for almost an hour." Jason's throat was dry. Had it really been that long? He glanced at the dashboard. Sure enough, time had disappeared. I'm fine," he lied. His voice sounded wrecked, unconvincing. The officer narrowed his eyes. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jason almost laughed at the irony. Instead, he forced a nod. Just tired. Long day. The officer studied him for a moment before stepping back. "Try to get home safely," he said before walking away. Jason didn't respond. He simply turned the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. It did. But the unease didn't leave him. By the time he reached his penthouse, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. His muscles ached. His mind felt like it had been wrung dry. He needed a plan. He needed to end this. As soon as he stepped inside, his phone buzzed. A text from Father Gideon. "Come back. Now. We don't have much time." Jason exhaled sharply. He barely had the strength to move, but something in his gut told him he couldn't afford to rest. He turned back around, grabbed his keys, and headed straight for the church. Father Gideon was waiting at the entrance, his face grim. "It's worse than I thought," he said, as soon as Jason stepped inside. Jason pulled his jacket tighter around himself. Yeah, no kidding. He unbuttoned his shirt just enough to reveal the handprint on his chest. What the hell is this? The priest's expression darkened. It's a mark of possession. Jason clenched his jaw. And what does that mean exactly? Father Gideon motioned for him to follow. They walked down the dimly lit corridor, the weight of the church's silence pressing down on them. It means, Gideon said finally, that she's no longer just haunting you. She's binding you to her. Jason stopped walking. Binding me? How? Gideon turned to face him. Your soul is being tethered to hers. The longer this goes on, the stronger the bond becomes. Soon, you won't just see her in the shadows. You won't just hear her voice. Jason's stomach twisted. He already knew the answer before the priest even said it. She'll be inside you, Jason. Gideon's voice was solemn. And when that happens, there won't be anything left of you. A cold sweat broke out over Jason's skin. No, he said, shaking his head. No, there's still time. You said there's a way to stop this. A ritual, right? A burial. Gideon nodded. Yes, but it won't be easy. You must return to where this began. The mortuary. Jason's breath stalled. He didn't want to go back there. Every fiber of his being screamed against it. But deep down, he knew there was no other choice.
So, I go there?
Jason forced out. Then what? Gideon's jaw tightened. We perform the ritual. You must speak her name, acknowledge what you've done, and offer her a final rest. If she accepts, the bond will be severed. Jason let out a slow breath. And if she doesn't? Father Gideon hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, Then she'll take you with her. Jason stood in the cold night air outside the mortuary, his heart hammering in his chest. The building loomed before him, dark and silent, its shadow stretching across the pavement like an omen. His fingers curled into fists as he exhaled sharply, forcing himself to take a step forward. Father Gideon stood beside him, a worn leather-bound book clutched tightly in his hands. His face was lined with exhaustion, his expression unreadable. Once we enter, there's no turning back, he said quietly. If we fail, Jason, you won't walk out of here the same. Jason swallowed, the burned handprint on his chest throbbing beneath his shirt. Then, we don't fail, he muttered, pushing open the heavy steel door. The smell of antiseptic and something older, something rotten, curled around him as they stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the tile floor. The silence was suffocating. Then, a whisper. Jason. He froze. The voice slithered through the darkness, closer than before. Father Gideon muttered a prayer under his breath and pulled out a small vial of blessed oil. He traced a symbol on Jason's forehead, the touch cold against his burning skin. We have to move quickly. They reached the morgue's back room, the place Jason had desecrated. The room was the same, yet different. The air felt heavier, like the walls themselves remembered what he had done. The metal table stood in the center, empty. But Jason knew she was here. Father Gideon set the book down and lit a candle, the flame flickering violently. Kneel, he instructed. Jason hesitated, but a sudden pressure slammed into his chest, forcing him to his knees. He gasped, his vision blurring as the cold seeped deeper into his bones. The candlelight dimmed. The shadows stirred. And then, she appeared. Anna. She stood at the edge of the room, her white dress billowing as if caught in an unseen current. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, her eyes black voids. But it was her smile that made Jason's blood freeze. It was soft, expectant. "You came back to me, Jason." Jason's breathing was shallow. His body refused to move. Father Gideon's voice was steady as he began the ritual. "Anna Delacroix," he called out, his words echoing through the morgue. "We acknowledge your suffering. We acknowledge your suffering. We acknowledge your pain. Tonight, we offer you peace." Anna tilted her head, her lips parted, her voice like a breath of wind. "Peace." The room shook. The candle flickered wildly, flames stretching unnaturally high. Jason's pulse pounded. Father Gideon didn't stop. "Your time in this world has ended. You must let go." Anna's expression shifted. Hurt, betrayal, something darker. She stepped forward, her bare feet not touching the ground. "Let go." Her voice was softer now, almost mournful. But Jason's body locked up, her words sinking into him like hooks in flesh. Father Gideon grabbed Jason's hand, forcing him to repeat the words. "Anna, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was wrong. I give you my name, my voice, to free you." The shadows twisted violently. Anna's face contorted, a mixture of longing and rage. And then she screamed. The sound was inhuman, a wail that shattered the silence like breaking glass. The walls trembled, the lights burst, plunging them into complete darkness. Jason felt her hands on him, cold, gripping, pulling. He fought to breathe, fought to resist as something invisible dragged him toward the morgue table. "Jason," Anna whispered. "Stay with me." Jason gasped. His body burned, the handprint on his chest searing white-hot. Father Gideon shouted the final incantation, his voice booming through the room. "Anna Delacroix, I release you from this world. Rest now." The force exploded outward. Jason was flung backward, crashing onto the tile floor. The air rushed out of his lungs, his vision going white. Then, silence. Jason's chest heaved. He sat up slowly, blinking against the dim light. The room was still. Anna was gone. Father Gideon let out a shaky breath, lowering the book. "It's over." Jason wasn't sure he believed him, because as he touched his chest, the mark was still there. Jason sat on the cold tile floor of the mortuary, his breath ragged, his hands still trembling. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint flicker of the single candle Father Gideon had relit. Anna was gone. Or at least, that's what he wanted to believe. Father Gideon slowly approached, his face lined with exhaustion. "It's over," he murmured again, though even he didn't sound entirely convinced. Jason swallowed hard, his fingers tracing the mark on his chest. The burn had faded, but the outline of the handprint remained, dark and shadowed, against his skin. A permanent stain. If she was truly gone, why was the mark still there? Jason forced himself to his feet, ignoring the dull ache in his body. His muscles felt like they'd been through hell. Wrung out, drained of everything, he turned to Father Gideon. "What happens now?" The priest exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You should be free," he said. But his eyes drifted to Jason's chest. "But..." Jason's stomach twisted. "But what?" Gideon hesitated. Then, finally. "Sometimes, even when a spirit lets go, a connection remains." Jason's jaw clenched.
"So you're saying she might still be here?"
The priest didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, gathering his belongings. You need to rest, Jason. The ritual worked, but your soul has been touched. That kind of bond doesn't break easily. Jason didn't like the sound of that. He didn't like any of this. But for now, he was too damn tired to fight it. The days passed in haze. Jason tried to convince himself that everything was normal again, that the weight on his chest was just in his head, that the whispers had stopped, that he could move on. But deep down, he knew better. He felt her. Not always, not every second. But there were moments when he passed a mirror and caught a glimpse of something behind him, when he stood alone in his penthouse at night and felt a faint breath at his ear. Moments when the air turned cold, when a familiar voice whispered his name so softly it almost sounded like the wind. Jason. He didn't respond. He never did. He went back to work. He tried to lose himself in distractions. Parties, business, anything that would dull the lingering fear curling in his gut. But he wasn't the same man anymore. His so-called friends noticed. "You've been acting different, man," one of them muttered over drinks one evening. "You're not yourself." Jason only stared at his glass. Maybe that was true. Or maybe she had taken part of him with her. A month later, Jason found himself at the cemetery. He didn't plan to go. He wasn't even sure why he was there. But as he stood before Anna's grave, a fresh bouquet of white lilies in his hand, he knew this was where he needed to be. The headstone was simple, elegant. Anna Delacroix, beloved and remembered. The words felt strange, wrong, because no one had remembered her, not until now. Jason knelt down, placing the flowers at the base of the stone. He stared at them for a long time, his mind drifting back to the night in the mortuary. The way she had looked at him, not with rage, not even with hatred, but with longing, loneliness. "I'm sorry," he murmured. His voice was quiet but steady. The wind stirred, rustling through the leaves. For a brief moment, he thought he heard something soft, almost like a sigh. Then, silence. Jason stood up, exhaling slowly. He turned, walking back toward his car, refusing to look back. He didn't need to. Because he knew. She was still with him. And maybe she always would be. The lesson of Jason's story. Jason Cole's journey is more than just a tale of supernatural horror. It is a story of arrogance, consequence, and redemption. At its core, this story teaches us that our actions carry weight. Jason spent his life believing that power, money, and influence made him untouchable. He mocked the weak, disrespected the dead, and thought he could walk away from anything without consequence. But in the end, he learned a harsh truth. Some debts cannot be ignored, and some wrongs must be made right. This story reminds us of the importance of respect, not just for the living, but for the past, for those who came before us, for those forgotten. Jason's fate could have been avoided if he had simply treated others with basic human decency. Instead, his arrogance led him into a darkness he could never fully escape. It also highlights that true change comes from within. Jason's survival wasn't just because of the ritual. It was because he acknowledged his mistakes. He took responsibility, and though the past never fully let him go, he learned to live with it. To honor the dead instead of mocking them. At the end of the day, we are all shaped by the choices we make. Respect matters. Kindness matters. And sometimes the things we think are forgotten. Remember us far longer than we expect. What do you think about Jason's story? Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if you love stories that make you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling and thought-provoking content. See you in the next one.